welcome to session 3 of Unit 6. And in this session, we'll be looking at the levels of testing. My name is Patrick Ej. Now, by the end of this session, you should be able to mention Bloom's 6 levels of cognitive objectives. Write examples of objectives based on each of the levels. And finally, state the 6 levels of Bloom's cognitive objectives in a hierarchical order. So let's look at the rules of testing. And just as there are levels of objectives, there are also levels of testing. And most often, evaluations that are carried out do not test for all the important objectives. So a teacher who evaluates the quality of his teaching from a purely cognitive test may not realize how badly or how well he is teaching, because the psychomotor and the affective areas need to be considered to give a comprehensive feedback to the teacher to enable him modify his teaching techniques. But here lies the case: the teacher is only using a test that is more or purely cognitive inclined. So in test construction, there are 2 major rules that you must consider as a teacher. And one of the rules is to use your objectives and scientific principles as guides in constructing your test. Now note that students tend to learn in the way in which they are tested. So when your learners find out that always your test is asking them lower level questions, or it is asking them describe, then they will learn as such. If they are only seeing what is mentioned, then they will also learn as such. So if the emphasis is on memorization of facts, they will memorize the facts to satisfy the teacher. So they will memorize. This is what basically we call the chew and pour. So the learner will chew every bit of information that is being provided to him or her, and on the day of testing, provide everything for the teacher. And if the emphasis is on the understanding of principles, development of process skills, or other investigative type of teaching, this will also reflect in the students' responses. Now, whenever we are writing objectives, you realize that to write an objective is very easy, but to evaluate the achievement is where the problem is, as to whether the objective has really been achieved. It now becomes a problem. And so because of that, Benjamin Bloom identifies 6 levels of cognitive objectives that must be considered whenever a teacher you are constructing a test. And these 6 levels is what we basically call the Bloom's taxonomy. And these are the levels. So we have knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. So these are the levels of cognitive objectives according to Benjamin Bloom. And so in a hierarchical order, you realize that knowledge is the lowest level of the cognitive objective. So either knowledge or remembering. Let's take note that it is either knowledge or remembering. Then we have comprehension, which is the next one. So we have comprehension or understanding, then application. So you realize that evaluation is the highest level of this cognitive objective. And anytime a teacher, you are constructing your test in the cognitive area, then your test must take into consideration all these 6 levels as given by Benjamin Bloom. And the second rule is that questions should be devised to evaluate each of those levels. So your questions should, as much as possible, evaluate some amount of knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, all the 6 levels identified by Mr. Bloom. And so writing good behavioral objectives based on these levels and using them as guides for constructing your test will provide us with better examinations, so that when the students take your question, they will see that no, almost all the levels. So at a point, they are being asked a knowledge question, at a point, a comprehension. So they have a mixture of all these 6 levels. And this is what makes a good or a better examination question. So let's look at the first level of Bloom's taxonomy. And the first level, which is knowledge, is the lowest level on the ladder, as we saw in the diagram of Bloom's taxonomy. And this level emphasizes simple recall or recognition and represents the lowest level of learning, requiring only memorization of information. So here, teaching mainly for recall is the lowest level of instruction, and because recall questions are easy to write, teachers often devote much time to this type of teaching. So we know that after we have given out the test, you have to mark, and so normally most of our questions that we give to our learners are in the lowest level, and we must take note that once you're always assessing the lowest level, and this level also emphasizes recall, it means students are most often going to do a chew and pour, whether they understand or not, and just pour that information for us. So a rule in this test construction is that no more than 20% of your test items should consist of simple recall questions. So we must take note of this rule. So a simple example, an example of a knowledge question. Mention 3 parts of a micrometer screw gauge. You realize that the learner will force himself to chew all the parts of a micrometer screw gauge, and once you ask, the learner will just pour 3 for you. Now let's look at the second level, which is the comprehension or understanding. And we know that students may know something about a topic. They will be able to follow a process, or they will be able to define a term in science without understanding it fully. So at the knowledge level, your learners can define, they can give the definition. However, understanding may not be there. And so comprehension requires the students to interpret a statement, translate or describe a process or idea in their own words, go beyond data, go beyond extrapolation of data, and supply intermediate information. So you realize comprehension now moves a step further. You must have an understanding before you can describe something. So even though comprehension questions are not difficult to write, they require deep thinking on the part of the teacher as well as the learner when the learner attempts to provide an answer to comprehension questions. So an example of a comprehension question is given below. Given a beaker of water, a piece of string, and a measuring cylinder, explain how you will find the density of an irregular solid. So you realize that the learner must have an understanding of how to calculate density of a body before he can proceed to explain how you will find the density of an irregular solid. Now let's look at the third level of Bloom's cognitive objective, which is application. And application requires a step beyond comprehension. We saw in comprehension that these questions require that the student knows an abstraction, said that they can demonstrate its use when they are asked a specific kind of question. But when it comes to application, it requires that given a new situation, the student can apply the appropriate distraction without having to be shown how to use it in that situation. So an example, explain why ships, though made of metal, float on water. So you realize that students will be thinking once ship is made of metal, then it should be sinking. So this question requires that the student gives the idea of density. The student must have an idea. It is the ideas of density that will be used in explaining this phenomenon. Now let's look at analysis. And analysis is related to both comprehension and evaluation. And it emphasizes breaking down the material into its constituents in the organization. So let's take an example. A given mixture is suspected to consist of iron filings, fine sand, and salt. Prove that the suspicion is true. So how does the learner do this? You realize this question requires that the student uses magnet, water, and heat the whole mixture in order to separate them into their individual components. So basically, it's separation of mixtures, and the student must know how the step-by-step approach of getting the individual components in this question. Now, synthesis. And in synthesis, it involves putting elements and parts together to form a whole. So, over here, this procedure usually involves combining previous experience with new material and constructing a more or less integrated whole. And so you will find out that synthesis is a creative activity. So an example of synthesis question: explain how you would find the density of cuboids. So you will observe that this question requires that the student first measures the size or the dimensions of the cuboid and then calculate the volume. Then the next thing the learner must do is to measure the mass of the cuboid before he or she can calculate the density of the cuboid. Now let's look at the final level of cognitive objective according to Benjamin Bloom, which is the evaluation stage. And here it is the process of judging the extent to which ideas, solutions, methods, and materials satisfy a criteria. So an example of an evaluation question: the percentage purity of a certain liquid is the percentage of impurities in a given mass of the liquid. Now, if the percentage purity is 8% or less, then the liquid is fit for drinking. So a liquid of mass 25.5 grams contains 4.8 grams of impurities. Is the liquid fit for drinking? So this is a typical evaluation question. And what does this question require the learner to do? This question requires that the student find out by calculation whether the liquid satisfies the criteria of containing 8% or less impurities. So once that criteria is being satisfied, then the student can say that yes, the liquid is fit for drinking, or it is not fit for drinking because it contains a percentage of impurities which is less or which is greater than the 8%, which is the accepted level. Now, students, in this session, we look at Bloom's 6 levels of cognitive objectives as well as examples related to each level. And as we bring this session to an end, let us have this as a take-home. What are the 2 rules to consider during test construction? And why is knowledge in Bloom's taxonomy regarded as the lowest level? I hope you enjoyed this session. Thank you very much for joining this session, and see you in the next session.